So this is who I am. I'm Max Payton. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself because I'm a local guy. I was born in San Francisco in 1961. Grew up here on the peninsula, spent my entire life here. I'll be 64 at the end of August, so I've been here my entire life. Grew up in San Francisco, moved out to Millbrae, Burlingame when I was in elementary school, went to Green Hills, went to Taylor, went to Mills, went to College of San Mateo, went to San Francisco State, went to Berkeley, and lectured at Stanford. So I know the whole area. I've been here so long I can't even tell you. So this is an accident. This happened in 1993. This is an accident. So a bit of my background. I graduated in '78 from high school. Graduated in '82 from college. I was 20 when I graduated. Had a bachelor's and master's at the same time, pretty much. Started at Lockheed. This man sitting here used to be my boss for about 10, 15 years. I did a lot of work I can't talk about. This I can talk about. I published about 40 or 50 articles, 6 book chapters, got 36 patents. I have a trademark on this. Basically, I've done a lot of stuff. I get busy. This is unclassified work. I was doing work for Lockheed for 30 years. This is part of it. And then after Lockheed, I worked at Visa for close to 15 years, doing work in payment processing, profiling, fraud detection, that sort of thing. This is back in the days of Lockheed, where I was doing work with satellites, specifically overhead reconnaissance. That's about all I can say. I was one of the engineers who worked on the original Iconos satellite, which went up in 1999. It produced 1 meter ground resolution, and that was a big groundbreaking accomplishment for engineering. We're very proud of that system. It was a lovely system. This work was done up in the Palo Alto Research Labs of Lockheed, back when it was called the Palo Alto Research Labs. They rebranded it as the Advanced Technology Center. It probably has a different name by now. We weren't supposed to do research after a while, but we did. We snuck it in while we were looking. I was working on a contract for a place called the Defense Landsat Program Office. Now, those of you who are old enough know what Landsat is. Landsat used to be a satellite that did land resource utilization. It looked at the Earth and tried to give farmers some insight into how they could best use their land to get best crop yield. And it produced a satellite which was 7 bands of data, spectral bands, where you had like red, green, blue, infrared, near infrared, and other kinds of bands. And it was very coarse resolution. It was maybe 10, 15 meter resolution at the max, if you really pushed it. And it was massively useful. It was put out for farm utilization. It was used for everything. And it was one of those things where it was a massively good idea, and the military figured, boy, if it can do what it can do with 7 bands of data, what could we do with more bands of data if we had more spectral bands? Think of the spectral band as like a layer cake. The more bands you've got, the more you can see, the more things you can distinguish. So it asked the question, well, what would happen if we created a satellite that had more bands of data and we sent all that data down? Well, the problem is that you can only send so much data down so fast. So they started looking at compression, being able to take the data that's collected and squeeze it down and maybe reduce a little redundancy, and maybe we can send it more efficiently, quicker, and get more data through the pipeline, if you will. So I worked on a project that looked at what happens if you perform compression, but you degrade the image a little bit, just so that you could get the data down quicker and more thoroughly. What happens? How does it affect the ground? When you get the data down, how does it degrade the performance of information on the ground? When we run algorithms to look at partitioning information, how does it degrade that performance so that you can't actually do it as well as you used to? That was the job that I was supposed to do. This was an accident. This actually came up as an accident on the project. So with that, let me begin with the phone. We begin our story up in Palo Alto. And actually that album was released the day that I started at Lockheed in 1982. So RUSB Wang. If you like Kevin Cronin and Roll with the Changes, that's your album. But this is how I got into good trouble. This started in 1993. We were on a DLPO contract to figure out what happens if you do compression. And you folks have all dealt with images that are compressed every day. Whenever you have a JPEG image, that image was compressed with loss. That's why JPEG works the way that it does. But we were looking at how could you generalize that for images that are multiple bands beyond red, green, and blue. We went beyond that. So I was looking at the effects of the compression on algorithms for these satellite images. How does it degrade being able to find edges, trees, tanks, other kinds of things that are of interest? We were looking at how do you numerically quantify what happens when you degrade an image. This was cutting edge at the time. People had never been done this kind of stuff on this kind of data before. And if you do a web search on our names, who wrote the article, it's been cited, and I keep getting pings every day or so from academia telling me your article was cited again by somebody else because it was groundbreaking at the time. It's seminal. The guy I blame for this discovery is Bob Herlick. Bob Herlick is the guy who wrote in 1973 an article about how do you classify images that are grayscale and partition it into regions based on the texture. And he was working at University of Washington when he wrote the paper in 73. Actually, when I did this work and we published articles on it, I actually got to meet Bob Herlick. He's an interesting guy. He's no longer around, but he's a really interesting guy. Anyway, he wrote this paper in 73, and it's based on the idea that if you got an image, it's made up of little pixels, and it's like a checkerboard. And if you look at a pixel and the area around it, you would look at statistics regarding the pixel and its neighbors. And there's all kinds of mathematics involved in something called a co-occurrence matrix. How often do you find a value next to another value, and in what position? And there's a lot of math involved in being able to compute some quantities. There's some summations and differences and things involved. It's pretty hairy stuff. It's really hard to read this, believe me. I had to go to the library at Lockheed and read this and actually implement it. And it's very hard to read it. It's hard to write the code to do this efficiently because it's a lot of number crunching. It takes a lot of time. But then you want to create this program, you make it run. How do you test it to make sure that it works? And the answer is you got to create a test image and run it to see if you get the answers you expect you're supposed to get. It turns out that about the same time Bob Herlick wrote that paper, a bunch of guys at MIT wrote a paper called HackMem, which is a little delightful collection of ideas for things that you can do with computers that solve really hard problems. It's a legendary paper. You can find it on the web. It's still on the web because it's so timeless that people want to use it all over and over. And there's a little item in there that just happens to be exactly the kind of thing that you need to be able to create a test image. Something called munching squares. And it turns out that if you take the index of the row of an image and the index of a column of an image, and you mask them together, you create a pattern. It's the basis of texture. And buried in that little HackMem thing is this thing that says, if you do the following, you'll get a pattern, and that pattern has statistical properties that are well known. Perfect. That's a great test case that you want to run the image on. It's a perfect image, and it's very simple to do. You take the image, and you create a little thing like that. It's an exclusive OR of the row and the column. It's a fractal. It's actually a fractal. It looks very similar. Basically, you can see that it repeats itself in scale all the way down. If you look at the distribution of gray values, flat. It's indistinguishable from noise. It's just random noise. If you look at the times that a value is next to another value, it's all along the main diagonal. And if you look really close, it almost looks like a pattern that you'd use on a sweater. The main diagonal entries, everything is well known. The answers are all known. You can compute them and everything. So I created it on a Mac. It was an old Mac using MetroWorks on a 170, a real old machine. And I used a free software package out there by National Imagery Institute of Health called NIH Image. And I hit the wrong button. I brought the image up and I wanted to look at the histogram to confirm that it was flat. But I didn't hit the histogram button. I hit the button right next to it that said random color. And what I saw was this.
Wow.
And what really amazed me was that I took a basic pattern, I hit random color, I got a pattern, hit the button again, got a different pattern, same basic image, different paint by colors. Thousands and thousands of things, millions are possible. And those of you who are old enough remember Jack Parr when he used to say something that was astonishing. He always said, "I kid you not. I kid you not." I was working with a lady, unfortunately she's no longer around. Her name is Sylvia Shen. Her paper, her office had a CalComp plotter outside of her office. And the afternoon before I did this, she replaced the cartridge, the toner cartridge. And she used to get in about 11 o'clock in the morning. She was a late worker. And by the time she came in, the toner was exhausted. And I have never told her why. But that's why. So I started printing these out, and I just print them one after the other after the other.
Oh my goodness.
And they're just, it's an explosion of color. And it's just simple squares. It's basically tiles on a carpet. So, but the real issue is I got a job to do. I can't make tiles and I can't make carpet for a living. I have to solve this problem involving images and texture. So can I get the job done, replicate HackMem, check my code out, run it, get the paper out, and make Mark Gersh happy. Science comes first and art comes later. And the answer is it's not hard to replicate what HackMem did. And in fact, this is what you get. And back in '72, they didn't have a lot of color monitors, so nobody figured this out. It was undiscovered. But it produces a cornucopia. And if you've got 256 possible values from 0 to 255, and each one of them could be a different color, which is red, green, and blue, and they can all have 256, you start adding up to some pretty large numbers. 16 million possibilities for triples. You can literally produce piles and piles of these things, some of which look like mud, but some of them are gorgeous. It turns out if you take the row and the column, you look at the bits of them, you can combine them in a bunch of different ways. Those of you who have had computer science know that we're talking about Boolean algebra. And there are 16 different ways of taking two bits, combining them together, and getting a result. And there they are. You can diagram them as a lattice, as a hypercube in 4 dimensions. And if you mix and match the bits in different ways, you get different patterns. This is all the basis of texture. So you can see where this starts to get into some pretty interesting mathematics. It gets you into logic, and it gets you into group theory, because this gets you into and dealing with objects and their properties. And you can imagine taking these and coloring them, and you get all kinds of interesting patterns as well. And those are the 16 different ways you can AND things together, you can OR them, you can exclusive OR them, you can equivalence. They're all 16 ways of doing it. And if you take one coordinate, which is your row, and one coordinate, which is your column, and you look at all of those 8 bits, and you take one from the one issue and one from the other, and you mass them together and do different things, you have almost an infinite number of ways of combining them and producing patterns. And so this is what the recipe is for doing that. And if you're willing to go beyond just simple true and false to continuous value, where you've got 0.0 being false and 1.0 being true, and you can be somewhere in between, you can actually do things in fuzzy logic instead of just Boolean algebra. And there are different ways of doing those 16 operations using fuzzy operation. So you could take subsets of bits from your coordinates, map them together into this continuous space, combine them together using Boolean algebra, get the value back, and put them together. And what you end up with is something that looks like Bob Guccione took a picture of a tile, because it's fuzzy, and it looks blurred, and it has some interesting properties. One of the interesting things is that why are they so interesting in looking? It's because they look the same all the way down. They're fractals. But fractals are usually generated using recursion. You gotta call yourself over and over and repeat yourself. This is actually produced using iteration, where you just loop through and you're not calling yourself, you're just doing things very numerically straightforward. If you look at that tile, it has an innate structure to it, which it looks like a quadtree. Each one of these is indistinguishable from noise. In fact, when I discovered this later on, when I was working on a project, we were using these things as test images to break compressors, because this thing is almost impossible to compress. There's no redundancy in it. So people were using this to take software and break it, to see whether it could handle the stressing case. And in a lot of cases, it wouldn't. It actually produced, when it tried to compress the data, it actually produced results which were larger than the original image, because it was so noisy. So they can't be compressed. And if you try and do something where you look at the wavelengths, you want to break it into individual components, it looks even wilder. It just has some very weird mathematical properties. Can you make carpet from the computer? Yes. This is taken from Mohawk, the Karistan carpet, and this is one of my tiles. So the answer is yes, you can make carpet from a computer. In fact, you can have computer-controlled looms. These really are tiles, and they do fit together seamlessly in all directions. These are squares. We'll get to some other stuff in a moment. Leads to a lot of questions. Just all squares and rectangles. What about triangles? They work. What about them? What about other shapes like pentagons, hexagons, n-sided things, arbitrary things? What about polygons that really don't even look like polygons? Can you put them together? How do you put them together? Those of you who are quilters are probably nodding, going, yeah. How many ways can you put them together? And is there a way of doing this in some kind of orderly fashion? Because pretty soon it gets out of control. Well, what about triangles? You've got A, B, C. There are ways of taking points inside the triangle, kind of like we were doing with the square, and say, well, pick a point P inside it. You subdivide it into subdot triangles. The areas all add up to A, B, and C. You can do the same thing using the areas as you did with the coordinates in the square. And you can even do things like ask the question, well, how far is it away from the sides? And use that instead. This is what is called barycentric coordinates or aerial coordinates. And this is what is known as trilinear coordinates, because you've got 3 lines and they're trilinear. So there are all kinds of variations and twists that are possible. And here, order of vertices is important. ABC is different than ACB, because one is clockwise and one's counterclockwise. Let's look at triangles. You exclusive order them the same way that I did with squares. Well, when you do that, you end up with something that looks like that. And that is a name. It's called a Sierpinski triangle, and it leads you into some very deep ideas in mathematics. And there's some quotes here. It's one of the most basic examples of self-similar. You see it's the same thing over and over again. It's a very simple idea. It's a pattern that can be reduced at any magnification. It's a fractal. And it's evident that similar structures can be built in any arrangement. So we're really getting down to the atomic nature of what's happening here. This leads to what I said about trilinear coordinates, where you've got a point and you're drawing a line to the perpendicular to the 3 sides of the triangle. Well, amazingly enough, this leads you into an area, something called finite element analysis. If you've ever driven a car, you've driven the result of finite element analysis, because what you're looking at is you subdivide a surface which isn't necessarily nice and smooth, or is smooth, into subtriangles and doing analysis on it. That's what's called finite element analysis. It's used in structural analysis, it's used in heat, it's used in weather to figure out temperature in areas where you don't actually have a thermometer. So we're starting to get into ideas which underlie all kinds of fields across all fields of engineering. So this isn't just art, it's actually mathematics making itself known as art. So it isn't very hard before you get into things where you're looking at research topics in engineering, and you're starting to look at how do they look artistically. This is an example. It's what happens if you go beyond triangles and squares to polygons with a lot of sides. How do you average and add and blend them together? And what happens if you deal with a polygon where it isn't convex? There's actually a notch into the polygon. Strange things happen. So this is the kind of cool stuff you can do with quadrilaterals. This is one of my degenerate cases, when I make things really simple and things simplistically come up. This looks very similar to a work of art that's done by a very well-known artist named Frank Stella. So when you start producing deformed results that look like modern art, you're onto something. Pentagons. Interesting thing that happens is that, number one, 5-sided figures don't tile very nicely. There's a whole study of people who are doing things with aperiodic tilings that work with, because pentagons are not nicely adding up together. You can tile triangles, you can tile squares, you can tile hexagons, but pentagons, they're a little squirrely. And so this is an example using certain kinds of polygons with pentagons. And this is how I did it. And I think maybe one of those is up on the wall outside. Hexagons are nice, they can do nice things. This is before I color it. Even coloring it sometimes actually degrades the image. But you'll notice for folks who happen to be Jewish, the Star of David is a beautiful hexagonal period. It's a 6,2 hexagon. But you can tile them together and produce wonderful mosaics. Octagons. That one is up on the wall outside. Octagons and squares form semi-regular tessellations. This is only at 75 resolution. You can outside it's at full resolution. And I call the ones before they're coloring, I call them prototiles. The reason I call them prototiles is because you can make anything you want to out of them if you color them the right way. So this is using a decagon where I connect each point to the one that's 3 after it, so it forms this kind of a star. Looks like a parquet in an entry hall of a large mansion, doesn't it? And the same thing here for 10,2, where it's a little different. I'm using stuff inside and outside, and you can see the interference. It's beautiful, and I haven't colored it. So I've been talking a lot about tiles, and those of you who are into this sort of thing, there are different ways of taking polygons and matching them together to form tilings. These are called semi-regular, and some are called demi-regular. That has to do with how they meet together at corners. And there are all these, there's a book called Tilings and Patterns. It's almost the size of a Bible. And it has an enumeration of all these different ways of taking things and putting them together. The 3 that we know about, that we all see over and over, is the fact that hexagons tile, squares tile, and triangles tile. In fact, any quadrilateral will tile. So those are the regular ones. Those are the easy ones. The other ones, you got to put things together. There's some assembly required on that. Those of you who are quilters or cross-stitchers, you're going to love this. Because these are basic quilt blocks from Barbara Brockman's encyclopedia. She has 6,000 different blocks listed. And there's another one by Maggie Malone that lists another 5,000. They're not an infinite number, but there are thousands, tens of thousands of different quilt blocks. Imagine each one of those little triangles and squares filled with a design. This is where this can go. That's the mental image to keep. Think about this, only each one of those squares filled with an ornate design. You can see the potential is amazing. If there were any folks here who were Islamic, Muslim, if you go to the Alhambra, this is what inspired a lot of artists to go out and create designs. If you look at the designs that they have in the Alhambra and on the walls and in the various places, this is the mother's milk of that. Imagine those filled with different algorithms that I've got. It never ends. Irish, same thing. Celtic art, knots. This is the Lindisfarne Gospel. There are ornate decorations found throughout Ireland. The Book of Kells, classic. Imagine those knotted designs individually filled with algorithmic art inside the loops. As I said earlier, it's engineering, but it's also in crystallography. When you talk about salt, talk about sugar, you talk about diamond, all these shapes are geometric. They're 3-dimensional geometry. We're dealing here with 2-dimensional geometry, and in fact, there's a whole nomenclature involved with 2-dimensional tiling. It's in the crystallography book. 2 dimensions is kind of degenerate crystals. 3 dimensions, there are volumes of books that deal with categorizing crystals. There are all these different ways of describing them. We used to say it in Lockheed, standards are a good thing, let's have lots of them, so that way we can all sort of argue about things. The crystallographers care about how these things look in terms of lattices because they run x-rays through them, and they want to know how it looks when they project onto a screen. There are 230 ways of doing it in 3 dimensions, but there are only 17 different ways of doing it in 2 dimensions in terms of repeating patterns. These are the symbols that are used in that. And there's a whole nomenclature where you describe it in terms of reflection, in terms of the glide, you slide, you reflect, you rotate, all these different ways of actually describing one in relationship to itself. And if you go around your house, you go around the neighborhood, it's everywhere. You look at a fence, You look at a bowl, you look at your clothing, it's everywhere. In fact, this is a great way of producing customized clothing, bespoke clothing. You could produce patterns transferred onto fabric, and I have. I've actually produced scarves with some of these designs on them. I produced t-shirts when I was an artist in residence. This got me an artist fellowship. Take a basic prototype like this, take 4 of them, put them together, color them, presto. Take a basic design like that, 6 of them, put 6 of them around, colorize, you've got an ornament. 25% resolution. If you look at it even closer, it would be dazzling. I give this talk usually around holidays, and the reason I do it is it's sort of a treat. If you look across religions, if you look across disciplines, the one thing is that people really do like geometry. Geometry is a way of being able to kind of get in touch with the infinite. It's why art moves people. It's because it has a spiritual quality to it. And if you cross religions, geometry occurs throughout all these different religions. So we use geometry to talk about things that we can't really describe through words. And so you find throughout history people saying things like, God is a geometry. And in fact, a lot of people say that the entire universe is God, and basically people wax poetic about these sorts of things. It isn't hard to see why, because beauty like this is very, very profound, and it's very moving. There are books out by Dover. You can pick them up real cheap, which has all kinds of stuff to do with design and ornament. Spanish tile designs. You can see that this is getting at an underlying truth that lies underneath all of the universe, really. Patterns and repetition and design and tile everywhere. It gets into science, it gets into art, it gets into all fields. A book was written by Herman Weil, who was condemning what was going on in Nazi Germany. And he was speaking of the swastika design. It's one of the most beautiful symbols, and it was used for terror. We see designs used for power, for expressiveness, for mood, cross-cultural. It has incredible power. It has incredible impact on a person's feelings. So, the to-do list. You can see that it begins to mushroom on you. There's things that are low-hanging fruit that can be done reasonably quickly. And there's some things that do require some thought and some foresight in terms of designing software. There are a lot of things you can do with variations on coordinates. Beyond Boolean algebra, you can take an image and smooth it. You can find edges on it. You can play with colors. Some are in terms of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and different color spaces. You can do fuzzy logic. You can look at different ways of tiling. You can take geometry and find centroids and do geometry operations with it. You can do variations on polygons. It just goes on. Finite element analysis, different ways of figuring out distances and angles. There are encyclopedias of things to do with triangles and things you can do with squares. And you can mix and match, and you could spend a lifetime doing it. And then when you're done with your lifetime, you can do even more. And it just goes on. And this is a list I assembled years ago. I'm not kidding you when I say this. My house has 10,000 books. I do. And in fact, if we have time for the next slide presentation, which we might, I can show you some photographs. I have over 10,000 books. And the reason I have over 10,000 books is because I've been collecting ideas for 30 years. And I have a stack of notes that's easily as tall as I am and probably could fill half this room. So It's a lot of stuff to do. This is why Escher kept busy for the rest of his life. This is an area that most people have never heard of. You all have studied geometry when you were in school and you've all dealt with flat surfaces. Well, there are other kinds of geometry besides flat surfaces. Specifically, there are curved surfaces like spheres. The guys who do navigation on the ocean and they fly over the Earth, they got to worry about curvature. They got to worry about the fact the Earth is an oblate spheroid. It's not flat. And so you got to worry about geodesy. What happens if you tile a sphere instead if you tile a plane? Now, what happens if you tile something that isn't even something that you've come in contact with? There's something involved in a space where you're dealing with hyperbolic geometry, where dents occur in space. You can tile that as well, and you think of what's possible here. If you look really close at this screen, you can't hardly see it, and I did it purposely. If you look really close, you'll see there's a compass here.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that intentionally because a lot of this is unknown territory. It doesn't take very long before you're no longer playing with art anymore. You're actually in mathematical land or you're in engineering land and you're doing research. You're producing new results that actually have impact in science and engineering that can do interesting things and provide useful tools to people who are looking for advanced ideas. So that's why I put the compass there, because this is actually doing stuff in unexplored territory. One time someone gave me a Tiffany compass because they said, you're out there, you're way out there. And I go, yeah, but it's fun. It's fun to be off of the paved road on the gravel. And we're starting to lay gravel down. I give this talk to software engineers, and I do this because art and science are closely related. And I give them some advice, and I give this advice to everyone, although you may not be a software person. Number one is to look for accidents. Accidents are good things. Sometimes they're bad, but sometimes they lead you into finding things that you didn't know that existed. I was not an artist. I was a scientist and an engineer. This got me into art. So art actually influences science in the sense that when we're an artist and we look to science, we look for ideas in science that we can use and make beautiful. So we look to science for the core technology that we look for in order to be able to create new kinds of ideas and new kinds of visualizations. And science looks to art because we look for patterns. Because if we can find patterns, it'll make our lives easier. If we can condense an idea to something which we know we can look for, it's good. It inspires us because we look for beauty. The best science that exists is beautiful science. Einstein used to say that. And so I took this from a poem I wrote a long time ago. Art is science that frolics and play, and art is science, and science is art is novel, new way. And the uniting element is pattern. It's not surprising that I would happen to fall into the pattern area. Everything that you do, look for patterns, because if you find a pattern, it'll make your life easier. And and I mean pattern in a broad sense. In the sense of software, you look for data structures, you look for algorithms that do the same thing and have the same kind of components. Items of commonality, you look for things that repeat themselves, and if you can find them, it makes life easier. Look for it, and you'll find your work is enjoyable. And there's some quotes I love. Einstein appreciated this more than most people, and that is, usually the theories that we love are the ones that are beautiful. That makes sense. That just sort of strike us as being inherently obvious. Feynman, who won a Nobel Prize and was doing work in the quantum area, he said that nature uses threads to hide itself. And in fact, if you remember my title slide, I had a Latin expression on there. It said, ars est solari artem. The purpose of art is to conceal art. The best art is art that doesn't say it's art. And the Yiddish proverb is, coincidence is when God chooses to remain anonymous. It's interesting because that actually derives a lot of Jewish philosophy in the sense that the best charity is anonymous charity. There's a profoundness to that. That's the presentation. And what you see out on the walls are just specimens that I collected from this universe. And there's some nice quotes. Bertrand Russell did work in epistemology and philosophy. And he believed that if mathematics is rightly understood, it's beautiful. Baudelaire is a poet, and he described very similar this kind of experience, an endless palace filled with all these different things, and it ages beautifully. And Blaise Pascal, who was the guy who came up with the first calculator, it was a mechanical one, he said about mathematics, this isn't just spring things that just show up and are gone. They're everywhere. And they're enduring and they live forever. And that's why I put the art up on the wall. That's why I do what I do. So, we reach a point where now it's Q&A. Because I hope I've left you kind of breathless and speechless. But you probably have some ideas. Questions and comments, or I can tell you about the art, I can tell you about what I did, except I can't tell you some of the stuff because I'd have to kill you. But I can tell you what I did at Visa, I can tell you a little bit of the unclassified work that went on at Lockheed, because it's really beautiful work. And it's a lot of your tax dollars that went for it. So you can ask about it, I can tell you.
Well, I just want to say I worked at Lockheed.
Yeah.
63 to 68 on the Agena satellite. We probably put up some of the stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. I was from 82 to 2011.
I was guidance and control engineer at Lockheed.
I worked on both ground and flight stuff for projects I can't talk about and things I can talk about. I worked on the ICONUS stuff.
Anyway, I really appreciated your whole presentation.
Thank you.
It was extremely interesting.
Thank you.
So how do you choose the colors?
Randomly.
Randomly? What do you,
In NIH image, there's a thing that I actually called this random color. And so what I do is I let it kind of cycle and iterate, and I stop it when it gets to something which I feel is visually very stimulating. But I could sit with you at this computer, and basically we could say, okay, we want this color to be here, this color, and basically you could design your own design. And it would be yours, entirely yours. Send it to DPI in San Francisco, have it printed and then sent to you. Yeah.
I just want to thank you. Again, I know others have said that too, but it's really was a remarkable presentation. And I did get a chance to look at some of your art out there on the wall, and it was well worth seeing. So thank you for bringing this today. And what I really appreciate is you bringing art opposite on the scale to science and letting them balance together. So thank you for that.
This is one of the problems that actually, when you get a lot of people get educated in mathematics and they hate it. They just hate math. And it's sad, because mathematics is beautiful.
Yes.
And it isn't the fault of the person. It's actually sometimes the fault of the teacher, the fault of the way that the system works. Because the reason why I do a lot of this is because I want to show people who hated math to go back and think about it again, to feel that they got robbed, and go back and go, you know, maybe there's something there that I missed. And this is an example of it.
What was really nice was I kept having questions as you were going through your presentation, and then you would answer them. And I thought, okay.
That's good. That's Lockheed training. It's like,
Thank you.
lead a person through you got a bunch of cobblestones, lead them through the path so that way they know where you're going. Exactly. Good.
And the beauty of math and art is just perfect. Thank you.
Good.
Did you ever think about commercializing, making
Oh.
ties, for
Why
example?
do you think I have a trademark on it? It's precisely for that reason. I thought about that. The difficulty is trying to sell art in the world a lot of it comes down to hucksterism, unfortunately. And I'm an engineer. When I went to school as an engineer, I was told, don't hype your work. If it's good, it should be self-evident to anybody that what you did was good. You shouldn't have to promote it. And the notion of having to get up in front of a group of people and say, oh, this is fabulous, and you gotta go get it, because it's like you gotta have the must-have thing. It's like, this is beautiful. I shouldn't have to tell people this is beautiful and you love it. It's just, this is nature, this is the universe. And I'm basically figuring out a way of making it evident. But yeah, it's hard to be an artist when you're an engineer at heart. Yeah.
So, Paul, you said you were at Lockheed from '82 to 2011. Did you move on to another company after 2011?
Went to Visa, and I spent from 2011 to 2024 at Visa.
Okay.
I started at Lockheed in '82 as an associate engineer. I left as a principal software engineer. I was in the vice president's office at research up in Palo Alto and ATC, and we moved back down to Sunnyvale in 153 building.
And what was your position at Visa?
And my position at Visa, I started as chief data scientist, and I left as chief software engineer. So I had 5,000 people that worked with me. And the stuff I did there was, when you get annoying things that say, well, I've noticed that you've been buying these kinds of things, would you like to do the following? I was the guy who figured out that. You looked at your MCC purchases and figured out your distribution and said, oh, people who buy this kind of stuff tend to be machine learning, artificial intelligence, that's where it's being used for. I also used algorithms to figure out whether that was really you who bought that thing at that place whenever they did, and you weren't somebody else stole your card and did what. Looking at your transaction history and figuring out, yeah, it's probably a valid purchase. That's what I did.
Very good.
With all art, you either like it or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And something like this, I was wondering if you had ever considered like a TED Talk.
The problem with TED Talks is that it's a lot of show and a lot of sizzle and sometimes not a lot of steak. But I would be certainly willing to give a TED Talk. I don't know how exciting or compelling it would be. I'm not like Eckhart Tolle, who would get up and talk about self-actualization and all that.
Right.
Well, not everybody, you lost me in the first 10 minutes, so
Oh, I don't think so.
But I know that what I see is beautiful.
Yeah.
So I can see where people in art or engineering could use this in so many different ways, and just not boasting as much as just making it available, because not everybody knows this.
What this leads to is, should I be publishing this? And the answer is, I published a lot of articles. The articles I've written deal with geometry in terms of being able to recognize objects in satellite images. For example, you take an image over an airfield. Can you identify where all the planes are? Can you identify what the planes are, what kind of planes they are, based on their geometry? And if I look at it from one direction, and if I look at it from a different direction, is there something that I can see which uniquely identifies it? And the answer is yes. And in fact, I've written about 40 papers on that. But it's like there's a certain point where you start getting into some of the mathematics and it loses people. People, they kind of go, well, I wasn't really good at this, and this is a little bit abstract for my liking, and I don't quite understand that. TED doesn't go beyond a certain level of superficiality. So there's a push and a pull in terms of, you want to go deep in terms of the details, a lot of this. I had to avoid, you notice there were no equations in any of this. I did that intentionally because I didn't want people to run from the room with their hair on fire.
Simple for us?
No, I want people to understand this. And equations they're nice, and they really are concise, and they explain stuff. But people have a phobia. You start showing them equations, and they'll run from the room, and they'll go, "Oh, I wasn't good at this." And there's no equations in this. But if you want to do this, if you actually want to make this work, you got to write some code. You got to write some equations and stuff. I don't want to do that. I don't want to burden you guys with that because that just turns you off. Now I wanted you to get the visual appreciation for it rather than have me sit down and give you a lecture on geometry. That's no fun.
Plus, it would be an 8-hour talk.
Yeah, it would be a lot longer. I'd turn into Buckminster Fuller or something like that, and that wouldn't be too cool. But I could do that. I certainly, if we had a blackboard, I could start doing that, and you could all leave and have one. No, I don't want to do that. No, the point is that's why we've got math and science kind of in separate camps. Is because so when I was going through school, there was a war between math and art. I mean, the mathematics people looked at the artists and said, "You guys are wild-haired people, and you're undisciplined, and you can't get a job, and you're terrible." And the artists said to the mathematicians, "You guys are completely self-controlled. You're not creative at all, and you're not going to do anything novel or creative." And the university was alarmed, and they said, "We got to set up a neutral territory where the two of them can take courses and make friends." And they created a program called NEXA for interdisciplinary studies. And the first class they had was on Leonardo da Vinci. It was a beautiful class. And it was a way of being able to make peace. And that's why I have a slide that says math and art are together. Because you can't have one without the other. And I've met people who were dancers who hated mathematics, and I said, what you do is mathematical. And the same thing is true with artists. When you make your pigments, and when you get into the nature of the painting and color perception, it's science, color theory. There are whole books that are written on that. My job in satellite imagery, a lot of it came down to image quality. How can you resolve, what can you resolve in an image, and what resolution do you need in order to be able to see something? And how can you distinguish something from something else? There's stripes on something. Does it distinguish it as is this a real missile or is this a fake missile?
Just recently they've done the same thing. I'm not sure about the timing, but with math and science and medical.
Exactly.
They've blended those
Yeah.
because they were like apart and separate, and they found out that it was so much better to combine the disciplines. And
Do you know that there are animals that actually can smell diseases? That there is. I'm going to start sounding new age, but I will say it. Brian Wilson did a song called "Good Vibrations," and everything in the universe is. If you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible part of the spectrum is such a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. There's X-rays, there's radio, and everything in the universe is wavelengths. So yeah, and they started hearing crazy things about people who can taste color. Synesthesia is what it's called. This gets into some very interesting things, and if you can bring disciplinary areas in together, that's where amazing things can come. Is in the interdisciplinary, is in the union between things that you would never think are related to one another. One of the great joys I get in life is when I go into a used bookstore, is I can see invisible threads between the different areas in a bookstore. Is that there are connections, and you begin to understand why people locate certain books next to certain books. It makes sense, and there's a certain kind of satisfaction in that when you see that.
So Paul, if I was still your boss, I'd ask you to add the following.
Sure.
Now you've done it. Would be, you came up with a way to colorize patterns that exist in the world. And you can take then music as an example, that's very formulaic, and you can color it. So you
Exactly.
can say, this is what Beethoven's Fifth looks
Mhm.
like. Or any other kinds of things that have some
That's
kind
correct.
of pattern.
In
You might
fact,
want to comment.
I will do. In fact, the Brandenburg Concerto, a lot of these classical things have mathematical properties. In fact, when we sent a message out to the solar system and beyond, we produced a golden disc which had the Brandenburg Concerto on it. When I was in college, I took a course in computer science, and it dealt with something called recursion theory. And there was a function in the class that was incredibly hard to evaluate. It's called Ackermann's function if you're in computer science. And you call it, and it just creates more and more and more memory, and it just consumes computational power. And I said, boy, it produces some new cool patterns. What happens if I make sound from those patterns? Sounds like a symphony. And it does. It's noise, but it has an interesting kind of improvisational jazz to it. There's an album that was done by Ornette Coleman back in the late 50s, early 60s, called Free Jazz, which is just noise. And it's still considered to be one of the groundbreaking pieces in jazz theory. So it crosses all sensors, it crosses all modalities.
But I'm talking about if you were to take any of those algorithms
Mm-hmm.
and produce the art,
You could,
so this is what
you,
the Brandenburg Concerto
yeah,
looks
like, yeah.
Or Fred Astaire dancing
And
with
in
Ginger
fact,
Rogers
that's-
relative to the pattern of his dance.
And in
Here's what
fact,
it looks
some
like.
of that is being done right now
Yeah.
in Museum of Modern Art. In the front lobby, some of that is actually being done, and it's dynamically being done through neural networks,
Yeah.
generative art. So yes. More questions?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.